All right, everybody, I am back for another Meta Monday. This is Meta Monday number 14 on our noble quest to review every single video on meta ethics on the entire internet and critique most of them. There might be ones where I'll say something good. Sometimes I say a couple good things. Usually it's critique. And let's get into it. I will be reviewing the second part of Derek McAllister on moral relativism, so part two to his video series. We're also scheduled to have a conversation, so we should be setting that up. So that's very cool. So he reached out to me and was very receptive to us having a discussion, ironing out our differences. I don't think we're going to come down I don't think we're going to converge on having similar meta ethical views, but I think it's really awesome when someone, when I critique someone and then they're like, all right, let's have a conversation. I think that's awesome. Even if it's an actual case where I think we may agree to disagree. I don't know. We'll see. But I love that. I love when I can have a conversation, or I'm expecting to have a productive conversation with someone I disagree with. I thought the my discussion with Mike Humer was like that with David Enoch. So I really love those discussions. I don't like all the internet vitriol that you see everywhere. So we'll see how that goes. I also did a video with Curiosity. It was a recorded one, so that'll be popping up on our channels sometime soon. I don't know when. So there's a couple videos then in the works. I've got the TikTok videos on the way. The upcoming one, I think, is one of the last ones before I'm able to actually start talking to people on TikTok. They had some kind of rule where you had to be on there for like 2 hours live before you could talk to people, or an hour. I don't remember how long it was, but I eventually did my time of just being on there by myself, and then I finally was able to do some calls. It all happened over about a 1 or 2 week span back in early April, and I think the end of March. And I haven't really done it since then. It's been months and months. So I'm thinking once I start burning through all those TikTok videos, there's maybe 9 or 10 of them. I'm not 100%. I could open up the folder, but I'm not going to bother checking. So that'll be a couple months of that. And then hopefully I'll have some new TikTok content. I don't know what's going to happen with TikTok because I keep hearing it might get banned. So maybe that'll be it. And I had my chance to do those videos and I just didn't. Let's say hi to the chat, and then we will get straight into the video. Give me one moment. I'm going to open up the chat and see what's going on in there. Give me 1 second. All right. Okay, so we've got, I don't know. I don't think I got started yet. When, okay, Matt, I think you were the first one when I started. So I think you're going to get the Lance loot. I've decided, even if I'm wrong, it doesn't matter. So Matt gets 1,000 Lance loot. Julio gets 500 and Jimothy gets 250 Lance loot. That's it for the Lance loot. Let's get the video up and going. I just see people saying hello. So hello to all of you. Oh, wait, no, there is a question. Let's see if it's a reasonable question. Okay. JPW says, how do you engage with the argument about moral trends indicating some underlying objective or inchoate moralities? So you may be referencing arguments for moral convergence. Mike Humer, who I just mentioned, actually has a paper arguing for moral convergence. He actually has a cool paper that brings up a kind of critique of his own paper later on, which I thought was just very cool and a really interesting way to write a paper. And so basically the way that this argument would work, if this is what you're referencing, is something like this. It's like, okay, well, if you look over, the span of time of human history, what you'll find is that people's moral values have converged on the same set of values over time. So people have gotten increasingly more similar in terms of their moral standards. So, at time one, you have this very wide variety of different moral standards. Some people think, yeah, it set people on fire. At time two, they're a little more similar. At time three, they're even more similar. And it looks like we're moving in a trajectory of people converging on the same moral values. Now, in principle, that doesn't guarantee that they are objective or stance independently true, like the moral values that we converge on, because you could imagine in principle people converging on similar food or music preferences for entirely mundane reasons. There could be really weird reasons. It could be that people became more genetically similar over time. Imagine it's like some science fiction-y thing, and we just decided to stop reproducing biologically, and we just only created clones of, and we all created clones of like one person named Steve, and just everybody was Steve, and so everybody liked the same stuff because they're all the same clone of a person. that wouldn't give you like, and so Steve loves purple as his favorite color. It's my favorite color. So would that be evidence that there is a stance independent fact of the matter about what the best color is? No, because we have an alternative explanation that accounts for why people would converge that doesn't appeal to or posit the existence of stance independent normative facts about color coolness or whatever, color bestness. And so the same could in principle be said about morality, but there is a possibility here. This would be the proposal that, hey, maybe the best explanation for why people's moral values have converged. I just gave you a far-fetched science fiction scenario. It's not that clearly. So the best explanation for why people's moral standards over time have become more similar is because moral realism is true. People, over time, the story could be people reflect on and come to recognize what the moral facts are, and it just takes time. And you could liken that to, convergence in science is probably some indication of or approximation of we're moving towards something that's at least more true than previous theories. So something like that. So you have alternative possible explanations for why. So basically, you have, basically the first observation is moral claims have converged over time. If we grant that that's true, then we could say that calls for an explanation. And so, what might the explanation be? It's either going to be some explanation consistent with anti-realism, or it's going to be some explanation that appeals to the existence of stance-independent moral facts to account for why people's moral standards have converged over time. Now, this is an abductive argument. It's not going to be it's not like a deductive argument that seals the deal if you accept the premises. It's going to be some sort of evidence in favor of moral realism, according to proponents of the convergence argument. And generally, what I would say about that is that I just think explanations that don't appeal to moral realism are more compelling. So in the case of why people's moral standards may have converged over time, I mean, first, we could question that. I don't really question it. I mean, maybe someone could come up with arguments for why they don't think moral standards have converged over time. But generally speaking, look at what I mentioned before. People's music and food preferences have become more similar over time. There's people all over the world eat pizza, they drink Coca-Cola, they smoke cigarettes. As the world has become increasingly globalized, cultures have come increasingly in contact with one another. Take languages, for instance. When different communities, if you have two communities that have been separated, let's say before boats or planes, there's mountains or lots of water between them, their languages would be very different. But if those communities converge, you may see a mix of the language, and then eventually they might end up having some homogenous language. So in the past, cultures and communities didn't interact with one another as much. There was more isolation. As societies have become increasingly globalized, culture and societies become more similar over time. And, people's moral standards converging can be accounted for by the gradual sort of a cultural osmosis that we observe in pretty much every other domain, in addition to some cultures being subsumed, wiped out, obliterated by other cultures. There might be other reasons, like as economies become more similar, or as people become more financially, economically, sociopolitically interconnected, they have greater and greater reason to adopt similar values for entirely sort of constructivist procedures. So for example, norms about how like red lights and stop signs, like traffic norms, are going to increase to areas that previously didn't have cars. And if one country invents cars, they got roads and traffic lights. Another country gets cars, they're going to start having norms about what side of the road you drive on, how what the speed limit should be, how you should handle traffic stops, that kind of thing. And so as societies have similar technologies and face similar circumstances and encounter similar challenges, on an anti-realist view, it wouldn't be surprising if they, for entirely, again, anti-realist consistent reasons, would end up developing or converging on similar sorts of normative standards. So I think completely mundane factors account for why people's moral standards may have converged over time. Nothing mysterious there. All right. Yeah. So Jimothy says cross-cultural contamination seems the most likely. Yeah, and some of it isn't just like incidental contamination. Some societies were eliminated, like people killed them, or they were absorbed in other societies. I mean, think of the spread of certain religions. So did the world in the past have greater religious diversity? Yeah. Did it have greater linguistic diversity? I don't know, but it certainly seems to be on the decline now. There's, all these regions, at least I'm familiar with, like in Europe, where there's small regions where languages are sort of vanishing as more dominant languages tend to take over. You can imagine in the past that when communities were more isolated, people had more opportunities to maintain local dialects because there weren't huge incentives to speak the the same language. And so in some cases, technology and other sorts of social changes are going to account for that convergence. Oh, right. And JPW says, yes, convergence is what I was referring to. Definitely more precise than moral trends. Well, I'm fortunately trends is close enough that it made sense. And Stands to Reason has shown up and said hello. Mind Onion says, hello, all driving today. Well, cool. You have something to listen to, I guess. All right. So let's get into the video. Is this it? Yeah. I was about to share this video itself on YouTube here. So I would be streaming a review of myself reviewing myself. I don't know what would happen if I did that. I don't know if it would cause some kind of collapse and like a black hole. I don't know what would happen if I started reviewing this video itself. Would it like do like a review of a review of a review? I don't know what happens. Okay. Kind of like when you stand with a mirror in front and behind you. All right. So let's pop it up to full screen. I'm going to just get started. And if there are huge problems, let me know if there's problems with the audio for me playing this. Oh, I forgot to mention, I finally got the arm set up. So you could see the mic is right here. Everybody let me know if this is good. Like, I don't know how much the audio changes. And I will give a shout out. I have to double check if they want me to the person that donated to, I guess you could say, me or the channel for me to get this. I also got, so I got this, but I don't know what other kind of improvements I can invest in, but I'll, eventually new camera and some other stuff. And then I have one other person to check with that made that gave me something very, very cool. And again, I don't know if people want me shouting them out. I really should check with people and then actually remember, like, hey, do you want me to mention you on my channel? But I'll check with them too. And then I could show you all the other thing that I got, which is super cool. All right. Oh, also I got new headphones. I forgot I was wearing these. Yeah, cool. So new stuff. All right, let's get started.
I know some professors who refuse to teach on this. I'm biased, but I'm fair. Now, let's look at the objections. And I've got quite a few here. The first one here, and I have these kind of divided as individual versus cultural, but many of them will kind of overlap. So let's look at the first, individual. Now, here's the thing. I said to you, this is the worst view I would ever cover in any class whatsoever. It's really conceptually bankrupt, I think. I can't make that decision for you. You have to make that decision. And this is what you're doing now. However, while I have all these objections, if this first objection were the only objection that I had, it would be enough to completely toss the view. It's such a damning objection. So let's look at it. It's self-defeating. Now, what does that mean? Self-contradictory, self-refuting. This means, okay, let's continue reading. In claiming that there are no objective moral truths, that itself is an objective claim to moral truth. Now, why would that be such a bad, damning objection? Is because if I got up in front of an audience and I said, I'm not speaking English, that is self-contradictory because that's what I'm doing. And I'm saying I'm not. And so if that's the first thing out of my mouth when I first stand up, I have undermined my position. Like you're not going to listen to a word I say after that. And that's what this does. It's self-refuting in that respect. It says there is nothing that exists out there, but it's making a claim about what exists out there. And really, technically, it should be, I suppose, agnostic about what exists out there, morally speaking. Now, the second
all right. So this is probably this is definitively incorrect as far as objections go. So I might just say this is the worst objection that we're going to see in the video. Moral relativism is not self-refuting. Moral relativism is a position about the relativity of first-order moral claims. So claims like murder's wrong, stealing's wrong, helping people is good. So first-order moral claims are sort of direct claims about what's right or wrong, good or bad, consistent or inconsistent with some moral standard, something like that. There are also second-order moral claims, and those are claims about the moral claims. And those second-order claims, you could think of those as meta-ethical claims. Claims like there are objective moral truths, there are no objective moral truths. Morality has this particular characteristic or that particular characteristic. It's not a claim about what is morally right or wrong, but it could be a claim about what it means for something to be morally right or wrong, or about the nature of morality. It's not a direct first-order moral claim. It's a second-order claim. Now, moral relativism holds only that first order moral claims are true or false relative to whatever it is that that type of relativism relativizes things to. Relativism does not apply the relativism to relativism itself. So moral relativism doesn't hold that whether or not moral relativism is true is itself relative. So it's not self-defeating. It's not self-refuting. I don't know where he got this objection from, but this is just not a good objection to moral relativism. Now, there are like global forms of relativism where they, like if you say all the truths of all claims are relative, then that claim would presumably be relative because it's included in the category of like all claims. But moral relativism is a claim that's basically outside. So you have the set of all first order moral claims, and moral relativism is not included in the set. So it's not referring to itself. And so it couldn't be self-refuting. This objection just doesn't work. Okay, so I see a few comments here, but we could get to those after we get through some other objections. So yeah, this one doesn't work. Let's see what else he's got.
Objection. If that is too abstract and, heady for you, the second objection is a concrete instance of that first one. So think about the principle of tolerance. And here I actually came with some examples to use. Now, I usually write this on the board. I'm doing this here in this sort of program, but you can see what I have here on the top, moral objectivism, on the bottom, moral relativism. And you have A, B, C, right? And you can think of these as A, B, C. You can think of them as individual people, like if you're thinking of the individual stripe, moral relativism, or you can think of them as different cultures, A, B, and C. Either way. And on the top view, objectivism, there is, as you can see, that bar goes across, the bracket goes entirely over. There's something, I've written moral law there, but you could say morality, you could say moral truth, but there's something that applies universally and objectively, kind of like laws of physics apply. It doesn't depend on how you feel about it. That's just the way things are.
Note that technically objectivism does not require that the same moral standards apply universally. Objectivism or realism is consistent with moral laws not being universal and them actually applying on a sort of local basis. So this characterization of moral objectivism is combining both realism or stance independence with some type of universalism.
Now, the interesting thing is that A, B, and C need not be aware of this moral law or these moral truths. They could be completely ignorant, and yet still be like, you could be completely ignorant of gravity, I suppose, yet still be subject to gravity, interestingly. Now, on the bottom, where it says moral relativism, there is no such overarching moral law. There just is, and so I've written this. I have a little bar there. We're going to draw an X to that because in reality, all we have are just these kind of mini bracket, the individualized, coherent systems, right? A does its thing, B does its thing, C does its thing, to each his own, right? Now that's the setup. I'm a visual learner. I like to think about this visually. But let's think about this next objection. When it comes to tolerance, what are we talking about? Let's read. Tolerance seems a good principle to operate by. And it's exactly what moral relativism uses. It says the way moral relativism presupposes tolerance, it's an objective moral principle that everyone should operate by. Now, what that means is that usually, and I've drawn here in the board, this is the way that moral relativism gets off the ground. The idea is that everyone should be tolerant of everybody else's decisions on how they want to run their life morally. That's just it. I mean, so agree to disagree. That is there in that principle of tolerance. I should respect other people's decision, and if B wants to do something that goes about his life and he wants to run it a certain way, what do I care, right? But as you can see, that presupposes that tolerance is this overarching view, right? Let's all get along. Let's all respect each other's decisions. And there is no such overarching view. So the real situation would look like this. You still just have those mini systems down there. You can almost think of it like this, okay? On the bottom, moral relativism would look something like a difference in playing a board game. Right. So like, let's say A wants to play a board game. They move their men using a spinner. B likes to move his men using a draw of cards. And then C likes to roll the dice. All right. And everything is internally coherent. That works for A, works for B, works for C, works for everyone. And that's totally fine because there is no overarching rule, let's say in our world, like that says the board games had to be played a certain way. That's exactly what we're saying about this. Like if there were such a rule that says, if you're going to have a board game, it needs to be done by dice, then okay. But there is no such thing. And so if A can get away with, hey, it's internally coherent as long as you're consistent with your own ethical standards, fine. You be you. You go do you. You be you. Agree, disagree. You move on to your way. Now, this raises an interesting paradox because this is called the paradox of tolerance. What if B, let's say, doesn't want to be a tolerant person? They just like in their moral system, they don't agree with being tolerant. A, of course, wants that, right? And so the reality of the situation, since there is no overarching tolerance law, right, moral law that says that everybody be tolerant, what A is saying is when he says, "Oh, that's not fair. Don't be like that." To be anti-tolerant would be like, what if B is just being mean? Let's say B is starting to attack A. Let's put it in real concrete terms. Suppose B is a real exclusive racist person, like a white supremacist, let's say. Like he does not want to practice tolerance of any kind because he doesn't like other races, let's say. He's very non-tolerant. Well, according to moral relativism, that's totally fine. He should be allowed to practice whatever internally coherent moral system that works for him. When A cries foul and says, "You're not doing it the right way," who cares? You don't have a picture of, again, there's no, that's like A saying, "Hey, buddy, you should use a spinner to play with your board game, not cards." But again, there's no law that says everybody should do it a certain way. So in the reality of the picture, A in crying foul is just saying, "Hey, this is what we do in our system, in the system of A. You're doing something different, and we don't like that, but we wouldn't do it in ours." That's all. That is all they're saying. And so, interestingly, the paradox of tolerance, you can have extremely anti-tolerant, coherent systems that proliferate, and this is all literally allowed. Very interesting. Now, look at the
All right. So this is why it's really important. This is, what prompted the conversation with me and this channel. Like basically the content that I've been reviewing from this channel is the previous video that he posted, which is it's really important to pin down what we're talking about when we're talking about moral relativism. There are at least three different sorts of claims that you'll sometimes see people mixing up when it comes to relativism. So I'll cash those out. The first is metaethical relativism, and there's several varieties and orthogonal distinctions. There's cultural and individual types of relativism. You might call one subjectivism and one cultural relativism. There's also the agent and appraiser distinction, which I've talked about a bunch on this channel. And so that's your metaethical views. And those are views about what it is that makes moral claims true. And what all of those relativist views have in common is that they hold that moral claims are made true in such a way that their truth status is indexed to one or more different standards. I could say two or more different standards. In principle, though, you could be a relativist and like everyone dies except one person. So it could end up that there's one standard, but like in principle, there could be more. So one or more different standards. It allows the truth status of moral claims to vary in accord with different standards. So moral claims end up being indexed. That is what unifies all of the relativist views. And it's a metaethical position about what it is that makes moral claims true. Now, there is also something that sometimes goes under the heading of relativism, which is a normative claim about how you should treat people that have different moral standards than yourself. And this you could call normative relativism. So normative relativism, it's not really relativism. Not really. It's a normative view. It's like a view that says, hey, if people have different standards and values than you, be tolerant of those people. Respect their other people. Don't interfere or try to impose your moral standards on others. So it's a normative claim, and it could come in varieties. It could be like you should tolerate others. You should, celebrate others, you should respect others. It could be cashed out in a number of ways, provided that they're normative claims about how you should or shouldn't treat people on the basis of different individuals or groups having different moral standards than your own or those of your culture. That's what's going to make those views, sort of cluster around one another. And then finally, sometimes people will just make these sort of descriptive observations, like people have different moral values or different cultures have different values. And that's a descriptive claim. It has no normative or meta-ethical implications. And sometimes people conflate that with relativism. And you could call that like the meta-ethical and normative kinds. And you could call that descriptive relativism. Now, normative and descriptive relativism, you might think, hey, those aren't really relativism. I agree. Yeah, I don't really think those are legitimate types of relativism. But what I think is going on here is that I think he's referencing a sort of broad popular conception of what I tend to call folk relativism. So there's this, within philosophy, there are these sharp dividing lines between different sorts of positions. And I say sharp, I should say relatively sharp. I mean, even the boundary between naturalism and non-naturalism isn't always so clear. Even the boundary between realism and anti-realism isn't always so clear. Some constructivists use realist or not realist. I don't know. Um, so sorry, I the screen blipped out and I was like, what's happening? And I lost my train of thought. Okay, anyway, those boundaries may blur, but even within like meta ethics, there's a clear enough distinction between meta-ethical relativism and then these sort of normative and descriptive claims, at least among academic philosophers that are arguing for and against various positions. However, relativism became this sort of popular thing that spread through academia, it spread through popular culture. I don't know how far or how wide it spread, but the sort of popular folk relativism isn't just a view about meta-ethical considerations. It's a kind of chimera. So different people espousing relativism in these sort of folk, like non-academic contexts, will espouse some combination. It could be, if we've got meta-ethical, descriptive, and normative, they could pick 1, 2, and 3. They could endorse all three. They could say different people have different moral standards. You should tolerate all those different standards, and none of them are really any more true or false than the rest. They're all equally true relative to their own respective frameworks. That then you got like all three. You got the trilogy of relativism. But it could be you endorse the first and the third, but not the second. You could say, yeah, different people have different values and they're all, true or false relative to their standards, but I don't endorse the principle of tolerance. You could have that view. You could have the second and third, but you don't even know anything about meta ethics. You could say, yeah, you should tolerate people. Everybody's different, but you don't really have a meta ethical view. Any of these combinations are viable. People, people can mix and match them and use them however they want. And so that's that type of folk relativism can run into problems. And so one of those problems might be you could think something like this. On the meta-ethical side of things, you might think, yeah, none of these standards are any more true or false than any others. All moral standards are relative. And then you could say, yeah, but we also all have an obligation to tolerate everybody else's different moral standards. Well, do we have an obligation relative to your standards, or do we have an obligation independent of the standards of any individual or culture? And sometimes, you might see people that are like, it's really important for us to be tolerant of others. And they get mad at people that don't tolerate others. And like, they insist you have to be tolerant. And that may appear to come into conflict with a commitment to relativism, because it would be inconsistent to say all moral truths are relative and it's a non-relative moral truth that you ought to tolerate people with different moral standards than your own. That would be an actual contradiction. Now, there isn't necessarily a contradiction if you're a relativist and you endorse both the principle of tolerance and meta-ethical relativism. It's going to come down to whether you endorse appraiser or agent relativism. If you're an appraiser relativist, you judge other people by your own moral standards. And so you could say, yeah, my standard is the standard of tolerance, and I think everybody should be tolerant, and I'll get mad at people that are intolerant. And that's actually completely consistent with appraiser relativism. It may come into conflict with agent relativism. I'm not going to go over that distinction again. I've gone over it many times in previous videos. So go watch my other videos. It'll give me more views anyway. Haha. And I guess while I'm at it, I got to get into the habit. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, do all that stuff. Check the link tree in the description, and I got a bunch of links to my other stuff, my blog and everything. My Discord server, you could join that. Do all that stuff. Yeah, I actually mentioned it in the middle of a video. Okay, so it looks like he's critiquing a sort of, it looks like he's pointing to internal tensions in a kind of folk relativism. And thing is, I agree with that. Yeah, I agree that to the extent that there are these popular conceptions of relativism, they do often seem to have these internal tensions. People seem to have incoherent, muddled, confused views about morality. They'll both say there's no moral truth, and then they'll be super insistent that you have to abide by their moral standards. And they may sometimes have conflicts in their perspective on the matters. It's not necessary, as I pointed out. Appraiser relativism and tolerance are consistent with one another, but it may not be. It really is going to depend on the type of relativism that they're actually endorsing. And I don't know what type of relativism people are actually endorsing. I suspect this kind of folk relativism is too underdeveloped to really have a clear commitment one way or another. It's not like if you went around asking people that will say they're relativists, that a majority of them will say right away, "Oh yeah, well I'm an appraiser relativist, so it is consistent." Who knows? So I don't know that people have straightforward contradictions in their views. Their views may just be really muddled and unclear. But in any case, to the extent that that's the case, yeah, that's worth objecting to. I don't know how strongly it's worth objecting to. But where I would get concerned about these sorts of views is when people are appealing to nominally metaethical views when really they actually have some sort of normative or political type of perspective. And that would be a concern for me when it prompts a type of moral complacency. If right over the border of your own nation there were like massive human rights violations, and you thought, yeah, well, it's over the border, and so technically it's good or it's right, or I have to tolerate what's going on in that culture because of the principle of tolerance, I would have problems with that. I wouldn't be in favor of that. And so to the extent that some commitment to some type of muddled folk relativism encourages a type of moral complacency or apathy, I think that's bad and that's worth objecting to. But note that that isn't really a reason to object to metaethical relativism. Maybe some type of agent relativism could end up giving you those sorts of problems, but not appraiser relativism. And I rarely see good critiques of appraiser relativism. Probably the best critique is that's not how people speak and talk, or sorry, speak and think, speak and talk. That's not how people speak and think. So it'd be some sort of empirical objection. But as far as people trying to leverage these normative objections, they don't really work very well, if at all, against appraiser relativism. They only really work effectively against agent relativism. Okay, let's have a look at the comments before we keep going. Yeah, so JPW says, well, there are a lot of people who value tolerance. This is not entailed by relativism. Yeah, so it's not entailed by appraiser relativism. Agent relativism is going to be a little more complicated with what sort of normative implications it may or may not have. And for anybody that hasn't heard the distinction before, I guess I'll mention the distinction quickly. So, appraiser relativism holds that you judge people's moral standards relative to the standards of whoever's evaluating them. So, it could be your own standards. And so, for an appraiser relativist, you could judge everybody everywhere by your standards. So, you judge people by your standards, they judge people by their standards, and moral claims are true or false relative to the standards of whoever's evaluating the moral claim in question. Agent relativism, in contrast, holds that moral claims are true or false relative to the standards of the agent performing the action or the culture of the agent performing the action. And in that case, if some other person thinks it's okay to go around murdering and stealing, then it is in fact okay for them to go around murdering and stealing. So each individual or the cultures of each of the members, the individuals within a culture, they sort of self-legislate what actions are morally right or wrong for them in a way that's only applicable to them and not applicable to everybody else. So you, as some sort of observer to this person's actions, would then have some sort of obligation to recognize that their actions are in fact right, so long as they're consistent with the standards of that individual or the culture of that individual. I draw that distinction because you could be an agent cultural relativist or an agent subjectivist. So an agent subjectivist would think, yeah, if a person thinks it's okay to steal, it is in fact okay for that person to steal. And that's going to run into problems where, like, let's say someone wants to steal from me. I think it's wrong for you to steal from me and that it's morally good for me to resist, and you think it's right to steal from me and it's morally wrong for me to resist. I don't know what an agent relativist would do to resolve those tensions, because if it's right for me to resist and it's wrong for me to resist according to your view, like which one do I respect? I don't know what to do in that situation. We would have to find an agent relativist. Thing is, I've never really met an agent relativist. I don't know anybody that endorses that view. There might be people that endorse something closer to appraiser relativism, but these sorts of views are fairly rare among academic philosophers. If they're going to endorse some sort of stance dependent view, it's typically going to be something that's got a bit more meat on it than this. That is, so some type of constructivism or something. I don't know. If you know a relativist, you could let me know about them, and maybe we could go talk to them and see what they think the implications of their views are. But I don't know of any philosophers that endorse agent relativism. Maybe I should go look for one. Okay. All right. Just looking through the comments. All right. Let's see. A comment about appraiser relativism. Frustrating thing about appraiser relativism, claiming to have better moral standards than someone else is vacuous by definition. I have better standards by my own standards. That's true. But I like my music preferences better than other people's music preferences, and I think I have better music preferences than other people. So call it vacuous if you want. I'm perfectly satisfied with it. But yeah, no, that would be true. That it would be vacuous to say that. All right, let's keep going.
Next objection. Number 3, moral disagreement is impossible. Now, it's nice to be like, okay, agree, disagree, and I'll play nice and get along. But it's much worse than that. For example, let's suppose I say abortion is wrong. You say abortion is morally okay. It's totally okay. If both of our statements are true, which is what moral relativism claims, then we really can't be disagreeing about anything. So, because it really literally looks like this. I'm A, I say it's wrong, you say it's not wrong. Well, why is it? Well, not only because those are different systems, like playing by the rules of the game, but literally, I'm just, again, if you go back to the handout, that quick and in a nutshell definition, that second part, there's always an assumed, if not stated, extra clause, true for me according to my culture or something. So what this is saying is, in effect, this. Abortion is wrong when A says that according to my moral views, and then B is saying abortion is not wrong according to my moral views. There is literally no disagreement even possible, because that's like saying, in my version of the game, we play with cards, in my version of the game, we play with a spinner. Or, hey, according to my taste profile, I like strawberry. According to yours, you like something else. Like, that is not a disagreement at all. We're both saying something true, interestingly. Now, let's move on to another.
So this sort of objection, the issue of this is that it presents a very narrow conception of what a disagreement is. It takes all disagreements to be disagreements about what is in fact true. Now, if you take a disagreement by definition to be a disagreement about what's true, like if you're just stipulating by disagreement, I mean a difference of perspective on what is in fact true, then a two different appraiser relativists are not really disagreeing when they make like seemingly conflicting moral claims. Here's why. When let's say I'm against let's say you have two different people. Why does it have to be me? So you have two people. One of them says abortion is morally wrong. One of them says abortion is not morally wrong. You could translate those statements for the appraiser relativists. And so let's say they're Alex and Sam. So Alex says abortion is morally wrong. Sam says abortion is not morally wrong. What Alex means is something like abortion is inconsistent with my moral standards. And then Sam says abortion is not inconsistent with my moral standards. Okay, well, if they're telling the truth, like if they're being sincere about their moral standards, both of those statements are true. And so there's no real conflict about what is in fact true. They're both reporting something about their own standards. His example was fine. Like if I say, I prefer chocolate ice cream over vanilla, and someone else says, I prefer vanilla ice cream over chocolate, we've just asserted two true claims. There's no conflict there. And so people might say, okay, well, if we look out at the world, it really looks like people are arguing about moral issues. And so that wouldn't make sense if they were all relativists, because why would they be arguing? Well, do people only argue about what's true? No. People argue about what to do. And so, this is something I put in sloganized form. People don't just argue about what's true. They argue about what to do. Let me start that over. I fumble my words there. People don't just argue about what's true. They argue about what to do. So, the classic examples I give would be a group of friends ordering pizza. There's no stance independent fact of the matter about what pizza toppings they should all get, but they can disagree on what pizza toppings they should get. You see how that works? So, you got a friend that hates mushrooms. You got a friend that's vegan. You got a friend that doesn't, that wants a bunch of meat. They want like a meat lover's pizza. So they all have different preferences and values. And if you ask them, like, do you think there's a stance independent fact about the correct pizza toppings to get? Let's all say they all took intro to meta ethics courses or something. They might be like, no, we don't think there's a fact of the matter. Well, do you agree on what toppings to get? No, that's what we're trying to sort out. So there's some sort of different conception of disagreement. What is it? Well, it's a coordination problem. Different people have conflicting goals or desires, and they have to negotiate those goals or desires. And so, if you see two people, one of them is in favor of abortion, one of them is anti-abortion, and they're both relativists. So they don't disagree about what's true in terms of the respective truth status of their moral claims because they're both reporting what their moral standards are. But they want different things. One of them wants to say outlaw abortion. One of them wants to legalize abortion. And so they come into conflict with one another. They want different things out of the world. They're definitely going to have a conflict. One might say, I don't want you to do that. So let's say two people, one person wants to come inside my house. They just want to come into my house and they want to take my stuff. I don't want them to come into my house and take my stuff. We don't disagree about what's true or false. I agree they want to come into my house and take my stuff. They agree I do not want them to come into my house and take my stuff. Does that mean I say, well, we don't have a disagreement here because we're not disagreeing about what's true? No, we have a disagreement. The disagreement is I don't want them in my damn house and they want to come in my house. So we might end up in a fight. I might end up resisting them trying to come in my house. I might call the police. That's a conflict. So if you don't want to call that a disagreement because you want to reserve the word disagreement for only disputes about what's factually true or false, sure, okay, relativists don't have disagreement. Why is that a problem? Like they could still account for people getting into moral conflicts. They could account for people arguing. They could account for people coming into conflict and clashing. They're having a clash of values. They're not going to have any problems actually explaining what people are saying or doing in everyday situations. So this is, again, not a good objection to relativism because relativists, I mean, one, we just don't need to agree that they're not disagreeing. That's a very narrow conception of disagreement. Disagreement, one conception of disagreement may restrict relativists from disagreeing, but other conceptions that seem perfectly reasonable to me would include relativism. And you could say, no, that's not true. They can disagree. The other is to say, okay, well, if you're going to narrowly define disagreement in a very particular way that excludes what relativists do think is going on, then while it's technically true that they don't have disagreements, that's irrelevant and it doesn't actually raise any serious problems for the view. So this kind of lose-lose for critics of relativism. Either the accusation that they can't disagree is false or it's true, but not particularly substantive. It's not really a threat to the position. Okay. Humane Havoc says, what sort of principles do you give to agents such as animals in terms of whether consuming animal products aligns with your normative views as an appraiser relativist? For an appraiser relativist, they could have any possible standards. So it's consistent with appraiser relativism to be in favor of animal welfare. It's also consistent with it to be against animal welfare. It's consistent with appraiser relativism to be like a completely dangerous psychopath that just says that it's morally good to kill everybody else. Like they could think anything. But you say to give to agents such as animals. To give to, like, are the animals the prospective agents here? So agent relativism wouldn't directly address which sorts of entities or beings count as agents. That there would be separate philosophical and psychological questions there as regarding what is or isn't an agent. That wouldn't be like part of or baked into the agent relativism position itself. That would just be extraneous philosophical considerations. So I don't know if that addressed your question, but that's the best I could do with what I got there. Zachman says, hey, hello. Matt Springfield says, don't moral realists claim that disagreements about what you should do are disagreements about what's true? Yeah. So they're going to think that, but that doesn't obligate anti-realists to think that. Like they don't have to agree on the nature of disagreement or what sorts of things count as disagreements or not. Right. So Matt says, oh, I see you're rejecting what realists are claiming must be true about disagreements. Yeah. So it's not like I think there's some fact of the matter about what a disagreement is. You could just stipulate what you mean by that. Do disagreements include disagreements about what to do or not? If they don't include them, then relativists can point to disagreements. They could point to conflicts about what to do, like they're not technically disagreements. So what? Or they are inclusive, in which case the claim is false. So again, either the types of conflicts that relativists can have with other relativists, we could say they do count as a type of disagreement, in which case the claim they can't have disagreements is false, or it doesn't apply to them. And so technically, they don't have disagreements, but they have conflicts that functionally amount to exactly the sorts of things we observe people doing anyway. So I don't see a good objection here in this point. Zachman says, I don't remember if you said it somewhere, but when you say X is wrong, what do you mean? What I'm going to mean is going to vary by context, but it's always going to be something consistent with anti-realism. It's typically going to be some type of subjectivist sort of claim, like I'm telling you something about my values, or some sort of non-cognitive claim, like I'm expressing some attitude I have. Could be an imperative, could be an emotion. So I'm going to speak in practice like a subjectivist or a non-cognitivist of some kind. And often there are a number of operating presumptions lurking in the background. I may presume that other people have intersubjective shared values with me, so I presume they're judging things by similar standards. So you could see that as like semi-constructivistic in certain sorts of ways, but there's never any realist presuppositions lurking in the background.
Objection down into the cultural variety. Number one, it is also self-defeating, which it just kind of replicate. Again, these can be shared, they can be blended, and but look at number two: criticisms of other cultures, nations.
Okay, so same issue here. Cultural relativism is not self-defeating. Cultural relativism's claims about what sorts of moral facts are relative are the first order moral claims of different cultures, and the claim that moral standards are relative to different cultures is not itself one of those claims, and so it's not applicable to itself, and so it's not self-defeating.
Etc. is impossible. Now, this is the first time, like the Holocaust. Okay, so this is the
Sorry,
first is
I
impossible,
let's really get into that second one because I think I was talking as he had started, and then because it kind of just cut it midway through.
which it just kind of replicate. Again, these can be shared, they can be blended, and but look at number two: criticisms of other cultures, nations, etc. is impossible.
So before, because several times I've waited until the end to say something. Um, it depends on whether we're talking about agent cultural relativism or appraiser cultural relativism. If you're an appraiser cultural relativist, it's trivially easy to criticize other cultures because the correct standard for you to employ when judging other cultures are your standards, and you could just judge other cultures by your own standards. So this is just not going to. This is a non-issue for appraiser relativism. For if you're an agent cultural relativist, this may cause you some headaches.
Now, this is the first time, like the Holocaust. Okay, so this is the first major red flag for the view. There's actually three massive red flags. And if any, like if you come across a moral theory, any theory that requires that you give up your deeply held moral intuitions, fine. I mean, I may need to give up, right? If they're like just surface level. But if it's something like Holocaust bad, that's a deeply ingrained moral intuition that I'm not willing to give up. That is really actually bad. So, well, does it say it's okay? Well, let's look at what it says. Criticisms of other nations, cultures, impossible. Hitler and the Nazis in the Holocaust was, according to moral relativism, right for them.
See, this is a problem. Right for them is very unclear. What does that mean? So if you're an agent relativist, you would be committed to something like an agent cultural relativist in this case, and you think that whatever fact cementing standards are in place actually entail that whatever the Nazis thought was right or wrong is in fact right or wrong. You may not think that. You may think that they didn't actually set the standards for the cultures of which they oversaw or were dominant in. You may not think that, but assuming you do, then the agent culture relativist would be committed to thinking it is in fact like what they did was morally good. That's it's pretty damn repugnant. So I think it's completely reasonable to respond to that by going, oh, holy shit, that's bad. But that same sort of issue does not apply to appraiser cultural relativism. An appraiser cultural relativist is not obliged to think that what the members of other cultures did is good. So if there's some culture that engages in like ritual human sacrifice or something, if you're an agent cultural relativist, you might think, well, it's their culture, so it's good for them to do that ritual human sacrifice. But if you're an appraiser cultural relativist, you would judge that culture by the standards of your culture. And if according to your culture, it's bad to engage in human sacrifice or do other sorts of terrible things, then it is in fact bad relative to your standards. I mean, it ends up being something just really trivial like that. In other words, the sense in which it's trivial is if you say it's wrong, what it means is it's inconsistent with your standards. And so all it amounts to when you say it's wrong is it's inconsistent with your standards. And so if it is inconsistent with your standards, so you find it wrong, and when you say it's wrong, that just means you find it wrong. That's the sense in which it's trivial. You're just reporting something about your attitudes or your values, or in this case, the attitudes or values of your culture. And so in that case, you would not be obliged to consider what the Nazis did to be morally good or permissible or not wrong or anything like that. It would be completely consistent to think that their actions were abominable. So it's really going to depend on the type of relativism, and he doesn't really draw the agent appraiser distinction here. And so it's very easy to criticize relativism as if the only type of meta-ethical relativism on the table were agent relativism, but it's not. There is appraiser relativism.
If we're moral relativists, we can't say that they were objectively wrong exterminating 6 billion Jews, Polish prisoners, Soviets, etc. All we can say is that it's wrong from our perspective. It's wrong for us. Now, you have the situation.
Note, by the way, like all we can say is that it's wrong from our perspective or wrong for us. If you're an appraiser relativist, there are no moral prohibitions against trying to stop people from doing stuff you disapprove of, like anybody, anywhere. So the cultural appraiser relativist wouldn't be stuck idly standing by going, oh, there's nothing I could do. It would be completely consistent to go and stop people from doing bad things in other cultures.
Like this. Again, there's no overarching moral law. A would be 1940s Nazi Germany. B would be us in the US now, let's suppose, if that's your country, or whatever country you have. And then they're okay with it, and we're not okay with it. There's no overarching law. So really, the situation just looks like this. And you might think maybe that's enough, but I don't think that's enough. I don't think that's a strong enough condemnation of the Holocaust. I don't know about you, whether you've ever been to, say,
yeah, he's got to have these strong emotional appeals. All right, good old Tom says, what about the common internet claim that relativists, even if they could judge, criticize other cultures, individuals, as appraiser relativists can't obligate others? Not sure that makes sense. Yeah, it does make sense. So if you're an appraiser relativist, and let's say you're an appraiser subjectivist, so you judge everybody else's actions by your own standards. So you go around and you say, yep, bad for people to do a Holocaust, bad for people to murder and steal and kill. It's all bad. And what that amounts to is you disapproving of it. It's not consistent with your moral standards. Well, all of those people and all those other cultures could readily respond, we don't give a shit about your standards. Like if I went around saying, imagine actually, instead of just saying, hey, don't steal, stealing is wrong, I went around actually like translating exactly what I meant as an appraiser subjectivist. I went around saying, hey, I disapprove of you stealing. The person in the middle of stealing is going to be like, okay, so I don't care. Imagine a person's like, they go into the building and they point a gun at everybody, hand over your valuables. And people hand over wallets, take off the jewelry, give away their wedding ring. And they get to me and I'm like, I disapprove. It's not like they're going to go, oh shit, I'm sorry. I didn't realize that you disapproved of me stealing from you. I'm so sorry. I won't steal from you because you disapprove. They're going to be like, I don't care. Give me your stuff. And you would probably want to hand it over under the circumstances. So appraiser relativists don't have the power to compel. Here is the dirty little secret about moral realism. Neither does it. So someone says, hey, it's a stance independent moral fact that you shouldn't, take my wallet and take my wedding ring and all that stuff. Okay, well, what if the person doesn't care? The person could say, yeah, I know it's wrong. I don't care. So if someone wants to favor some view where they claim that knowledge or belief in the moral facts is intrinsically motivating, you have some type of motivational internalism, they're welcome to make a case for that. That in virtue of believing the moral facts, you're somehow thereby, at least feasibly motivated to comply with them. Make your case. But if you're not, okay, well, knowledge of the moral facts is insufficient to provide any motivation at all. And I have no interest in complying with stance independent moral facts. I act in accord with my own standards and values. I don't value whatever these stance independent moral facts are. If they happen to accord with my values, then my actions would be overdetermined, and so it would be irrelevant. So in other words, look, I already think torturing people for fun is wrong. So if it turns out it stands independently wrong to torture people for fun, okay, well, I wouldn't have tortured people for fun anyway, and I would think it was wrong anyway, so that's not adding anything. It's not giving me an extra reason that I'm responsive to. Alternatively, if it said, no, actually, it is okay, in fact, it's mandatory to torture people for fun, well, too bad for the stance independent moral facts. I don't want to do that, so I'm not going to. So Stance independent moral facts, unless someone wants to do some fancy metaphysics or fancy psychology or something, they are completely impotent. They don't do anything. They have no power to compel. They can say on paper they have authority. That's not authority. Authority is like an actual person or a god that could strike you with lightning or throw you in jail if you don't do what they say. That's authority. Authority is a real thing. The kind of phantom authority that non-naturalist realism has is, well, first of all, naturalist realism doesn't have any authority at all. Um, but non-naturalist realism, it can pretend to having some type of authority. It can have some sort of philosophical authority, but it has no practical authority. It can't actually compel anybody to do anything. It's all yelling on paper. Someone screaming at you on a page. That's just wrong. You shouldn't do that. It's true that it's wrong. It's really, really true. Yeah. Well, if you don't care, you don't care, and that's not going to move you any, at all. So, yeah. So you could say, hey, appraiser relativism doesn't obligate you, and realism does. Okay. Oh no, I have realist obligations to do things. That's not. I've made fun of this before by by saying it's a bit like someone insisting that you have to follow the rules of a game that you don't want to play. So someone runs up to you in the street and they're like, "You're breaking the rules," and you're like, "What rules?" The rule? Oh well, the rules of the game that I'm playing right now. You're breaking them. You can't walk on the street. And if you say, "Okay, well, what happens if I continue to walk on the street?" And they're like, "Oh well, nothing. Nothing happens." Like, what happens if I violate the stance independent moral facts? Nothing. There are no consequences. There's none at all. None. There are no consequences to breaking these rules. So they have authority over me, authority that's not backed by any consequences. What kind of authority is that? That's not authority. That's totally empty authority. Sometimes realists might want to say that you're irrational if you violate these stance independent moral facts. But that requires a conception of rationality where rationality is divorced from achieving my goals and doing what I want. I only endorse personally instrumental conceptions of rationality. Insofar as I'm going to employ rationality, it's going to be about achieving your goals. So, here's someone to be saying, but if you don't comply with these authoritative moral facts, you're being irrational. Okay, well, what does that amount to? Well, so if I am rational and I comply, that means acting in a way where I don't achieve what I want and I'm less successful by my own lights. What the hell? That's what rationality is. Rationality is failure. It's a lack of success. That's no type of rationality I care about. Just imagine. So look, realists will insist that their position is intuitive. So they find it intuitive that the rational thing to do is to act in a way where you undermine your own goals and don't achieve what you want and you are a failure by your own lights. What? Whereas on my view, a rational person is a person that effectively acts so as to achieve their goals and desires, whatever they happen to be. So, if a person really, really, really wants to set the world on fire and they do so, they really effectively, they found the best method to set the world on fire. I would say, yeah, they're rational. I don't like that person. I really hope they don't set the world on fire and I'll try to stop them. But I don't know in what sense they're irrational. The sense of irrationality, these realists, want to impose on us in favor is one where facts about what it's rational or irrational to do, at least on some conceptions of rationality, they may think instrumental rationality is another type of rationality, is totally divorced from your goals and values. It has nothing to do with what you want or what would lead to your success. I'm not interested in that. I just want to succeed at whatever my goals happen to be. And as a matter of fact, I think that's how all or most people are. I don't think people are, and I question whether they even could be motivated to do things that are against their interests, like with the perfect knowledge of that fact, like to intentionally act in a way that would undermine your goals and values. Can people do that? That might just be fundamentally at odds with how agency actually works. Because if you acting, I would take you to always be acting or motivated by your goals or desires. So how could you act or be motivated to act on a goal or desire you don't have? How would that even work? To me, that doesn't make any sense. Humane, I'm just reviewing a meta ethics video, so I'm not going to get into the normative moral questions. This is not the video to do that. Hey, Inyinzi. So Inyinzi says, yeah, what are these stance independent facts going to do? LOL. Hit me with a stick. I just act in accord with my desires. It just so happens my desires are to generally be a nice person. Exactly. That's exactly how I look at it too. And Yenzi continues, I think the realist gets worried about psychos who just want to be bad, and there's nothing they can say if moral realism isn't true other than, but I don't want you to do that. Right. And so, imagine there is this psycho that doesn't care about moral truth. And so you say, hey, but it's like there are moral rules and you're violating those rules. They could also just say, okay, I don't care. Now, like get in the hole and put the lotion on the skin. You know, um, so they could act exactly the same way, unless you think that they're somehow going to go, oh, I didn't realize I was breaking the rules. I guess I'll leave you alone. Why would they care about that? Yeah. So Jimothy says the stance independent facts are the stick that realists want to hit you with. And Yinzi says they want authoritative oomph than what moral. They want more authoritative oomph than what moral anti-realism provides. Yeah, and what they have is a kind of phantom oomph. It's a ghost oomph. It doesn't really have any. I've seen that. I don't know if it's Richard Joyce or somebody else threw around the phrase practical clout. They don't have anything like that. They're not actually able to push or compel us in any particular way. All right.
A Holocaust memorial museum or even one of the concentration death camps. A couple of years ago, I went to Auschwitz in Poland, and it is just the gravity of walking on that, going into where they gassed people to death. You walk in some of the rooms, you see the shoes, you see the crutches, and medical devices, handicap devices, and the suitcases, and then they'll let you take pictures of all this, but what they won't let you take pictures of is the hair. They still have, after 80-something years, the hair of people that were shaved off before they sent them to the baths, the showers, which were really just the gas chambers. There was still some concern about gas in the air or in the rocks that they prohibited having open flame anywhere. Back to the red flag in those cells because it's just too dangerous. And if you have, back to the red flags things, if you have a moral theory that just says, we wouldn't do that. It's not something we would do, but the Holocaust, I mean, not only we wouldn't do that, but you also have to simultaneously affirm that it was right for not.
Right. See, so an appraiser relativist does not have to affirm that it was right. Now, someone could say, but an appraiser relativist does have to affirm that if a Nazi said what they were doing is right, that it's true. That's technically true, but note that what that amounts to is, again, a trivial claim that even a realist would have to agree to if they agreed with the semantic thesis. What that would amount to is when a Nazi said that like was doing something bad and they said what I'm doing is good, that amounts to them saying that they approve of what they're doing. So it would amount to a Nazi saying, I approve of what I am doing. And that would be true even if we all rightly regard it as totally abhorrent and disgusting and horrible and awful. This would be the same as like if a person that wants to like set a building on fire says, I want to set this building on fire. Okay, well, I don't want them to, but it's true that they want to set the building on fire. So that's all appraiser relativism would commit you to saying about Nazis is that Nazis that are, and it's only specifically Nazis that approved of their own actions. So if they like secretly actually hated what they were doing or something, then it wouldn't be true. It's technically that Nazis that approve of their actions approved of their actions. And when they said that what they were doing is good, insofar as that entailed or just analytically was equivalent to them saying that they approved of their actions, it's technically true that when they said that they approved of their actions, they approved of their actions. Like it's saying it's something trivially true that has no implications about what kinds of attitudes or moral standards we have to have regarding their actions. It's completely consistent with acknowledging that people that approve of the terrible things that they themselves do approve of those terrible things that they themselves do. It's completely consistent with that to disapprove of what they're doing. So appraiser relativism, insofar as it is a accounting for or a thesis about moral language, does affirm that if someone else has contrary moral standards to you and they make claims about their own moral standards, that those claims can be true. And so if they say, like, if the person that wants to steal your wallet says, it's good for me to steal your wallet, you would have to affirm that statement is true. But what that means is something like that person saying, I approve of stealing your wallet. Well, of course, if they approve of stealing your wallet, then if they say, I approve of stealing your wallet, that's true. But again, so that has no implications for what you have to do. So appraiser relativism doesn't carry any normative implications. It carries no practical implications about what kind of attitude that you have to have towards other people's actions. It's completely consistent with appraiser relativism to have any attitude at all about someone else's actions. You are not obligated to care about or respect their standards or values. So it's completely consistent with appraiser relativism to think everything that he's shown here is absolutely repugnant and awful and terrible.
Nazi Germany to do that. That was right. According to their internally coherent moral system, they were actually morally correct in doing what they did. We wouldn't do that. Any moral theory that can only give that light of a condemnation is a really, really massive red flag. Now, but
It's not even really a condemnation. So it's a pretty bad normative moral standard. But note that that's not really a meta-ethical view. I mean, the idea here is that, yeah, some people with a certain meta-ethical view that's entangled with certain normative views ends up normative, like their first order normative judgments are that these really horrible things are good. And we don't agree with those first order horrible things. Sure, but you reject that on normative grounds, not meta-ethical grounds. So it's not really a critique of any particular meta-ethical view on meta-ethical grounds. It's a critique of a view that entangles meta-ethical normative considerations, and it's only being critiqued on normative grounds. So it's not a good objection to meta-ethical relativism. It's an objection to a type of relativism that entangles normative and meta-ethical considerations.
let's look at the next one. Moral improvement as a society.
All right, let's get to that, but a couple comments here. Father Kara says, and if the moral facts turn out to be very unintuitive or don't match what we conventionally agree is moral, I see no normative force in going with the unintuitive moral facts. Exactly. People would just not comply with them. And, this is something I sometimes ask moral realists, like, what if you became convinced? Like, what if, and not through some clear means of reasoning, but let's say you have a machine. And I think, what's his name? Justin something or other. He has a paper on this. Well, I can't remember his name. Justin Horn. He has a paper, I think, where you have a machine that is like always correct, and it delivers the moral facts, kind of like in Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. So you have a machine, and it delivers the moral facts to you, and you know that it works, and so it delivers moral facts. And there are things like you should always torture babies, or you should just punch everybody for fun. I don't think, and I hope realists will go, well, those are the moral facts. Ugh, I don't want to do that, and just not do it. So I think if the moral facts deviated too much from what realists were subjectively inclined to do, like in other words, if the stance independent moral facts were too far from their personal moral standards, they just wouldn't comply with them. And so, they're always critiquing anti-realist views for being super counterintuitive, but I actually think that people's operating psychology is a lot closer to the way anti-realists approach things. I actually think realists have very strange views. Their views have all these like extra components that seem inert. They don't do anything. They're superfluous. They're weird. None of that entails that they're wrong about that, but they got all the funny stuff going on. And anti-realists have a very natural account of human psychology and how people think about things and how disagreement works and all this stuff. And I actually think it's the realist views that are really, really, really out to lunch. And they've just been decades framing this conflict as one where the anti-realist has these like wildly counterintuitive views that might win in principle on some sort of like naturalistic grounds, or some sort of stark, practical, hard-nosed view about what reality is really like, where you get rid of all the frilly realist facts. And that's not how I approach the difference at all. I actually just don't think realism has anything going for it intuitively, practically, philosophically, metaphysically. It's got basically no advantages. It's a real weird as a position, because I think it has no advantages and only downsides. And I don't think that that's generally true of a lot of philosophical positions that one could potentially endorse. I think it's like one of the worst positions that lots of people endorse that I could think of in terms of its actual defensibility. And I don't know how they've pulled the wool over everybody's eyes so thoroughly that people actually think this is a reasonable view to have. But that's my take on it anyway. JPW says, to Yenzi's point, I think Lance is mistaken when he says there's no realist oomph. The oomph is you'll be punished by a greater power, or your behavior will have non-ideal outcomes to you. Both of those are consistent with anti-realism, though, and neither of those are derived from like the realism itself. So you'll be punished by a greater power. That is extraneous to whether you violated a stance independent moral fact or not. So it's completely consistent with anti-realism to say that you'll be punished by a greater power. And what's delivering the oomph there is a practical punishment, not the fact that you violated a stance-independent moral fact. So some sort of ideal observer theorist or divine command theorist that has a distinctively like metaphysically crude view of divine command theory. I'm not saying that they have to be anti-realists, but they could say moral facts are fixed by whatever God's commands are, and they're arbitrary and relative. They could think something like, or stance dependent. They could think something like that. And in that case, they would be an anti-realist, and it would still be the case that violating the rules would get you punished. So no, this doesn't rescue realism at all. And the same thing for behavior will have non-ideal outcomes. That's non-ideal outcomes in what sense? Non-ideal relative to your own preferences and desires. Okay, then consistent with anti-realism. Not relative to your preferences and desires, then how does it have any oomph? So no, that's going to be a lose-lose too. Either the way in which you have non-ideal outcomes matters to you, in which case it can be handled by anti-realism, or it doesn't matter to you, in which case where's the oomph coming from? So JPW says, but in both cases, it's just axiomatic, not empirically demonstrable. Mistaken is overstating it, more like not accounting for opponent's perspective. Yeah, I don't think I'm failing to account for anybody's perspective. Okay.
Is impossible. In this example, let's take, for example, slavery in the U.S. So this is different from the other one because in the first one, we're thinking of different cultures, like let's say Germany over there, let's say, versus the U.S. over here. They're doing something different, and the U.S. is doing something completely different. We just kind of have different perspectives. This one is using the same culture, but at different times. Because what this objection says is that moral improvement or moral progress itself is actually impossible. Why? Well, because, well, we can think of them in different cultures, us now, us, them, 1860s US, where they were totally permissible of slavery, not totally entirely, but in the large majority they were. And then in the US now, we're not. And this is another major red flag because we can't say, like, we would like to say, look, even if you're very, you're Black Lives Matter, you really love the idea of reparations and all that, and you're very, pro African American, Black, and so on and so on, and you hate cops. Let's just imagine that's your situation. You would still want to acknowledge that, in the very least, our society is better off, morally speaking, that we've improved. We're not perfect, but we've improved because we don't have slavery anymore. That's been like the chattel slavery in the American South. On moral relativism, you can't say that. You cannot.
Yeah, so this is just not true. For relativist, whether there's been progress or not, or whether there's been improvement or not, is simply judged relative to the moral standard that you're evaluating things as being progress or not relative to. That we already have. So, like this notion that it's impossible to have progress in relativism is just demonstrably false. Just think about the instances of progress relative to goals you set for yourself or personal values that you have. Let's say you want to become a better painter. You could get better at painting relative to whatever standards of painting that you're judging your own painting by. You could do the same for exercise. You could get better at performing certain sorts of athletic, feats. You might say that those are stance independent facts. Whether they're better or worse, there are descriptive facts about what, like that, and those are stance independently true about what, in fact, you're capable of performing. But whether or not that's better or worse has to be judged relative to some standard of evaluation. It'd be pretty weird to think there are stance independent facts about like how awesome or cool or great or how much you've improved. If those don't work for you, think of someone becoming a better chef. Do you think there's stance independent facts about what food is good or bad? If not, then how do you think someone could become a better chef? How is that possible? Again, you could cash it out entirely in terms of descriptive claims, but that's not going to give you any type of stance independent realism. And you'd still want to say, I think, most of us, that people can improve. In other words, simply put, people can improve relative to made up goals, personal preferences, values. You could make progress in a video game. You can make progress on entirely personal projects for which there's no stance independent normative facts obligating you to do those things or evaluate those things accordingly. So we already make progress in all sorts of instances or domains in which it would be really weird to think that there are stance independent normative facts about those domains. So this idea that you can't make progress in a relative sense, no. So if by progress he just means progress in a non-relative way, then this is trivial. It's just saying, hey, relativist views don't allow for non-relative progress, and so that's bad. That it might as well be saying atheism is wrong because it doesn't allow for God to exist. Like it's just saying, hey, an entailment of this view is that if this view is right, then the views that it rejects are not right. So that's a problem. That's what this objection would sound like if that's what he means by progress. So you have another problem here, which is if progress is stipulated, like in other words, by definition, to exclude the kinds of progress that's consistent with relativism, then he's saying something trivial. He's saying any view according to which there can be no non-relative progress holds that there can be no non-relative progress. Okay. But if progress is inclusive of the kinds of progress that's consistent with relativism, then it's simply not true that it doesn't allow for progress. So, like one of the other objections, either this objection is not true because relativism does allow for progress, or if you want to say no, but it doesn't, like what I mean by progress is a type of progress that's inconsistent with relativism. Okay. So then you're saying something trivial. You're saying relativism is inconsistent with non-relative forms of progress. Of course that's true. Who cares?
Not say that we're better. Because again, going back to the bar, there's no overarching moral thing that would judge whether this one is good and this one is bad. There is no such thing. It's just we do it different. The most we can say is that we wouldn't do that, as I see on this handout. The most we can say is that our culture now doesn't approve. It's wrong for us. Though again, simultaneously affirm this, it's apparently right for them at that time. Now, that's another major red flag. Now that completes that handout, but I've got one more. This is called the top 10 problems of moral relativism, inherited by one of my professors. And I'll look at a couple of them. The second one is actually the third major red flag, so we'll get to that in a sec. But first, let's look at one. The scope of cultural moral relativism is hopelessly vague. What constitutes a culture or group in the relevant sense? Most people belong to several groups, say American, university educated, Christian, Southern, and so on. There may be conflicting values between groups, so what gets the priority? For example, let's say that I'm a pregnant young woman who's Catholic and lives in Southern California. I'm a part of different cultures. I'm part of the California culture that says, hey, abortion is totally permissible and even probably a good thing and progressive. My Catholic culture says it's totally not permissible. It's bad. So which one takes precedent? Which one takes priority? Which culture do I belong to? And you might think, well, you just go with the one you most strongly identify with. But that's not good enough. Because that just, at that point, is just a matter of preference. I like this one more. It appeals to me more. No, morality shouldn't be like that. I like this one more.
Well, where does he get like morality shouldn't be like that from? Like, why should I accept that? So yeah, maybe you just go with the one you prefer the most. Like that seems a little ad hoc and kind of goofy to me. So I don't endorse that, but I don't like that's not good enough isn't any sort of substantive objection to someone saying that. So uh I'm not seeing a strong objection to this here. I'll have more to say about this in a moment.
So I'm going to do it. Morality is a lot more binding than that. So
yeah, so like a relativist can just they're not obligated to agree that morality is a lot more binding than that. So he's just appealing to his own views to critique a view that doesn't necessarily entail the view he's critiquing it for. I mean, again, this is a bit like saying, hey, if you're an anti-realist, you don't think morality is binding. Morality is binding, and so anti-realists are wrong because they're failing to capture facts about what morality is like. But of course, an anti-realist could just be like, I don't think it's binding. So they're not obligated to grant the presumption that he has here.
oh, that's a problem.
Okay, I think he's going to move on. So this vagueness issue would only be an issue if you take relativism to, if you're trying to like act on it in a way where you think that it's supposed to give you a definitive answer to what like the correct course of action is. So this might be a problem if you're some type of agent relativist of some kind, where you're thinking, okay, well, what actually fixes the moral standards for me? Is it because if you could be part of an ethnic group, you could move to another country, you could join a new religion. And so you're part of an ethnic group, but you're part of a different religion. But that religion is at odds with the broader culture that you're from. But you could live in a sub-community that's a smaller sub-community within a larger community. That at the net. So then, which standard are you subject to? Your ethnic standards, the new religion you've converted to standards, your local community standards, or the overarching standards of the nation that you move to, or the standards of the nation that you move from. There's a whole bunch of possibilities, or your family standards. Who knows? There's so many standards that you could be subject to. And if you think that there's got to be some definitive resolution to that, you could say, well, relativism doesn't have a clear answer to that. Now, One, maybe it does. You could just come up with some answer and think, yeah, I think this is the answer, and so relativism is back on the table. But if you're an appraiser relativist, you could just say that your actions could be right, or like when you're saying something, there might be some fixed fact about, like if you said my actions are right or abortion is wrong. Um, there may be some determinate fact about which one of those standards you're appealing to, and then it would be true or false, and that's not really an issue. And more generally, you could just judge. You could say, well, there's going to be some fact about whether a given action or judgment that you make is true or false relative to each of those standards. It's true relative to this one. It's false relative to that one. It's true relative to the third one. It's false relative to this fourth one. Not a problem, because it's not action guiding in that respect. Again, appraiser relativism just doesn't really fall victim to these objections. They all seem to be objections to agent relativism, and like some potentially very crude form of it. I don't know even if all of these objections would land for an agent relativist. I suspect they could wiggle out of some of these at least. But appraiser relativism just doesn't have this issue. So again, these objections are narrowly targeting a very specific type of relativism. And so far, pretty much all of his objections have either been kind of vacuous, or they relied on accusations that are either, like when clarified, or disambiguated, or they're either stripped of any like dialectical force, or they're just false. Other ones don't really disentangle meta-ethical relativism from like normative considerations and other sorts of stuff, and so they don't really work as a critique of meta-ethical relativism. And then others, insofar as they are critiques of meta-ethical relativism, are only critiquing a very narrow form of it, which is specifically agent relativism. And so what we have here is nothing by way of a substantive critique of a distinctive meta-ethical appraiser relativist position. We don't have any solid critiques of that view. And that view is like one would think, if you're going to go after meta-ethical relativism, that would be your target, not all these like vulnerable targets like folk relativism and agent relativism.
And that's only when you consider two cultures. Many of us are part of dozens. The second one, third major red flag, reformers. If moral relativism is true, then what is right is defined as whatever the cultural majority believes is right. Then somebody who's a moral reformer, like Jesus or Martin Luther King Jr.
Here, he should have been more clear here. This would only be true specifically of agent cultural relativism. This wouldn't apply to subjectivism, and it wouldn't apply to appraiser relativism. So again, these sorts of critiques are at best very narrow.
Or Gandhi, right? You can name all these kinds of people. They are by definition morally evil. They are morally wrong. They are bad for what they're doing. Why? Because, well, the culture sets the morality and you're going against the grain. That means you're in the wrong. You're actually, so all those abolitionists who were abolishing.
Yeah, again, if you're an appraiser or culture relativist, then you could say that the actions would be wrong according. So, like, if you're an abolitionist, your actions would be wrong relative to the standards of proponents of slavery, and your actions are good and, if not morally super awesome, relative to the standards of abolitionists or people today, or me, because I'm anti-slavery. So, if you're an appraiser relativist, it would be trivially easy to just say that your standards would be right relative to one standard and wrong relative to another. And so this idea that reformers are doing something wrong, just that's not true. They will be wrong relative to the standards of people that are anti-reform. They're not wrong relative to the standards of people that are pro-reform. In fact, they're right. So appraiser relativism, again, just doesn't have this problem. And also individual relativism, I don't think is going to have this problem either, because if what's right for individuals, whatever they endorse, then reformers are going to endorse their reforms. And so it's right for them to be in favor of reform. So again, this only applies very narrowly to agent cultural relativism.
Slavery, those people like William Wilberforce, he, Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, all those people were morally evil because they were going against the cultural correct thing. Not just because, not just that, but the morally correct thing, because what is morally correct is defined by culture on this view. So that is a major red flag. Any moral view, again, that says this should really raise red flags for you. In this case, this moral view is the consequence of it is saying that Jesus, Gandhi, all these abolitionists, by definition, Martin Luther King, they are morally evil, not just because of but because they were going and trying to change things for what they thought was the better. Who cares? They were going against the grain. That makes them evil. That's a massive red flag. Now, a couple of other ones real quick. I want to take a look at number 6. There can be no moral persuasion. So we looked at the idea that you cannot have disagreement. That doesn't even exist at all. But let's suppose you could disagree. let's suppose that you could disagree about flavors of ice cream, right? Like morality is like that. Like I like strawberry, why don't? That's not truly a disagreement because we're just both saying the true thing. But let's suppose I wanted to persuade you of my tastes of things. I wanted to persuade you of the right, correct moral view, which I think, but I'm just a relativist. Well, the objection here is that there can be no moral persuasion. What would I do or say? Go back to the example of, cilantro. If you have the gene marker that makes cilantro taste like soap, there's no arguments or syllogisms that you can provide and lay out to me that will make me like that more. Like, I'm still going to think it's gross, right? Because it's like I approve, I disapprove, I like, I don't like. If that's what morality is, then there can be no moral persuasion.
Yeah, not a good objection for the same reason, well, very similar reason as disagreement. Uh, we can definitely persuade people to change their moral standards, well, if we're anti-realists. What you can appeal to are mistakes in a person's non-moral beliefs. And so a person could have some moral principle or standard, and they could endorse some sort of moral position. They could take a stance on what laws there should be or institutions there should be. I'll give an example. Let's say a person is in favor of abortion, but they would be against abortion if they thought that the fetus were conscious. And then you present them empirical evidence that fetuses are conscious. And so they say, okay, well then I'm going to become pro-life and I'm going to be anti-abortion. Alternatively, you could convince them of the alternative. They may think that they are conscious and that that's what matters, and they're against causing unnecessary suffering. And then you convince them that the empirical evidence shows that fetuses up until a certain point in gestation are not conscious, and then they might think, oh, okay, well I was pro-life, but I'm going to be pro-choice up until that point, or maybe a little bit before, just to be cautious. So a person's views about the rightness or wrongness of abortion can be contingent on non-moral facts, like when a fetus becomes conscious. And by appealing to those non-moral facts, you could persuade them. And you could persuade them in a way that's completely consistent with what they consider to be right or wrong being entirely a matter of their personal values or preferences. You could also point out inconsistencies in people's standards. And insofar as they care about inconsistency, exposing that inconsistency, they may want to get into a state of reflective equilibrium and resolve the inconsistency. They may do that by changing their moral standards. You can impose some sort of penalties. And so you could say, look, if you don't change your mind on this, I'm not going to talk to you. So you could use coercive methods. This is what we do with law. So is that really convincing? Is that persuading someone that they're incorrect? No, but it's altering their behavior. And so, the kinds of things that you would get out of persuasion here. I mean, one, you just can persuade people as an anti-realist. And two, insofar as you can't persuade people, that you're not like barred from doing the same, like in practice, pretty much everything that would be practically relevant for trying to either alter the standards of or prohibiting someone from doing stuff that you disapprove of morally. So yeah, it doesn't have a problem with like anti-realist views, in other words, and relativism in particular, don't really have a problem with persuasion being an issue. What you couldn't persuade someone of is that their actions or values are stance independently wrong. But so, yeah, of course you can't persuade them of that unless you're lying or something. So yeah, of course that would be trivially true, but like so. I mean, imagine saying if you're an atheist, you can't sincerely persuade people God exists. Okay, yeah, I guess not, because you don't believe that, so you couldn't sincerely do it. Not a good objection to atheism. Now, if someone goes, but clearly God exists, so you should be able to persuade people, that'd be a ridiculous objection. And the same thing here. If the objection is, if you're an anti-realist of some kind, like a relativist, then you can't persuade people that things are stance independently morally right or wrong, like sincerely anyway. I agree. Trivial objection. If the kinds of things you are persuading people of don't entail the stance independent moral facts, then why couldn't you persuade them of it? So you see, there's the common pattern in these objections, which is when you disambiguate what the objection is, they're either asserting something false or something trivial.
Okay. A couple more of these: impossible to live out consistently. Uh, it's morally incoherent. We saw that. 9. Moral relativism is incompatible with our moral knowledge. This is the thing we were flagging when we were talking about those 3 moral flags. We have deeply held moral intuitions, some of which you may need to give up. Right? Like maybe it's eating meat factory farm, whatever. Right? But maybe it's not. Maybe it's maybe it's, I don't know. environmental concerns. Like some of those are moral intuitions, but they might not be as deeply held as, hey, genocide bad, slavery bad. Like those are ones that so deeply held and obvious to the knower, the person who has more knowledge, which is anybody can have that, that those are not things that you should easily give up. And yet moral relativism is incompatible with those. So when I come across a theory like this that says, hey, give up, don't worry about those deeply held moral intuitions.
Yeah. So if you're an appraiser relativist, none of this follows. So nothing about appraiser relativism would require you to give up any of your moral standards. It would just say, yeah, when you make claims about what's morally right or wrong, you're reporting your personal moral standards. No problem.
I probably, instead of giving up the intuitions, I need to give up the theory. All right. Finally, moral relativism, if taken seriously, has tragic consequences. It's fine to talk about it as long as you think no one will really take it seriously, but ideas have consequences. And when taken seriously, the idea of moral relativism has terrible consequences. Now, if I put this into practice and live it out, I get something like what Mussolini described. Mussolini was a contemporary of Hitler. I had to tell my students, you know who Hitler is, obviously, but Mussolini, he was the figurehead in fascist Italy at the time of Axis powers in World War II. And listen to this is a direct quote from him. He says, everything I have said and done in these last years is relativism by intuition. If relativism signifies contempt for fixed,
I do wonder if this is a real quote. Is relativism by intuition? That's a very strange thing to say. I mean, assuming this is a legit quote, well, I'll have stuff to say when he finishes.
categories, which he does.
Sorry, let's start it over.
I have said and done in these last years is relativism by intuition. If relativism signifies contempt for fixed categories, which he does, and contempt for men who claim to be bearers of an objective and more.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, is he espousing moral relativism of a distinctively metaethical form or some sort of broader relativism? It's unclear.
Total truth, which it does have contempt for that as well, then there is nothing more relativistic than fascistic attitudes and activity. He says, from the fact that all ideologies are of equal value, which is what relativists claim, they're all just kind of my view, your view, let's all agree to disagree, to each its own, that all ideologies are mere fictions.
Yeah, so relativism does not hold, like metaethical relativism does not hold that all ideologies are mere fictions. It's a view specifically about the truth status of moral claims and what it is that makes them true. I don't know that if ideologies is too broad because that may include things other than specifically first order moral claims, probably does. And it does not hold that they're mere fictions. So this characterization, whatever type of relativism he's characterizing here, it's not clear whether it's intended to be metaethical relativism. Even if it were, it's unclear whether it's agent or appraiser relativism. Even if it's some type of relativism, it's unclear whether it's some distinctively moral type of relativism or some broader, more global type of relativism. And then even then, his characterization of it is inconsistent with how you characterize global relativism. Relativism, it would of those forms would say that claims of a certain category or kind are true or false relative to different standards or frameworks. Could be of individuals, could be of groups, but it's not a feature of relativism that that those like systems of evaluation are mere fictions. They would all be true. So when I'm a relativist about food, and if you're a relativist about food, and I say pineapple on pizza is good, and you say it's bad, it's not a fiction that it's good according to my standards and bad according to your standards. Like I do like it, and if you don't like it, you don't like it. Those aren't fictions; those are real facts. So what I would just say is this is a shitty characterization of relativism. This has nothing to do with relativism as a metaethical position. It's certainly not appraiser moral relativism. I don't know what the hell this is. So just saying, hey, I mean, what he did is he found some terrible person that is using similar language to a view that's held in the academic literature and says, look, this evil dirtbag said that he's a he's a relativist, so relativism bad. It's not a good argument. I could imagine I find some quote from some genocidal maniac saying, moral realism galvanizes us to do what it needs to be done, which is to slaughter all these people or whatever. Could I leverage that to say, see, these are the tragic implications of moral realism. They lead to genocides. I wouldn't do that. It's not a good objection. It's not a good objection because the kind of crap this guy's saying, just like Mussolini, this like crappy remarks, Just they're no indictment of appraiser relativism.
which is another consequence. So the modern relativist infers this, that everybody has the right to create for himself his own ideology and to attempt to enforce it with all the energy of which he is capable.
So note that last part, and enforce it with all the energy that he is of which he's capable. So that would be inconsistent with his earlier views about moral relativism committing one to tolerance, because this is a very intolerant view. So what's up with that? Like, what type of relativism is he criticizing? So earlier in the video, he was criticizing a type of relativism that entails tolerance, but now he's characterizing a type of relativism that explicitly advocates for the imposition of one's values on others, which is the diametrical opposite of a very tolerant view. This is advocating for explicit intolerance, or at least saying you have the right to be as intolerant as you want, if not outright endorsing it. So those are inconsistent descriptions of relativism. Again, I would ask, what relativism is he critiquing here? I don't think that he's ever been clear on what form of relativism he's critiquing, and it still looks to me like it's like a grab bag of like. And note, by the way, Mussolini is not an academic moral philosopher. He's not a contemporary meta-ethicist. Why is he extracting views about philosophical positions from dead politicians? It's a weird way of, I'm not going to get my views about what moral realists think from, I don't know, some dictator from 200 years ago or something. It'd be really weird. Like, what if all my claims about relativism came from this or that genocidal maniac, or I got them from like Napoleon or something? Who gives a shit what Napoleon said about moral realism if he said anything about it? He's not a philosopher that is carefully talking about things in an academic context. I don't care what he says about realism.
And that's what will happen if there is no truth of morality that we are all bound to live by. Then it's just
what does it mean, bound to live by? So let's say realism is true. In what sense am I bound? How am I bound? Now, as far as acting in accord with my own values, I am bound by my own values in a certain sense. I have no idea how I could possibly do anything other than comply with my own goals and values. That's just what I do. I think that's what everybody does. But if there's this external set of rules, how are we bound by them? What does that mean?
a matter of whoever the biggest is, whoever's the most powerful, they get their way. They get their way. It's not a matter of, like, if I try to persuade you, I don't need to persuade you of any truth because there is no truth. It's just a matter of,
I don't need to persuade you of the truth because there is no truth. So relativism is not the view that there's no truth. It's not the view.
well, if I like my theory more, which I do, of course, that's why I hold it. I just want to enforce it on you. And if I'm really powerful and bigger than you, then I can do that.
Here's the thing. Isn't this exactly what we already do anyway? Do we go around finding criminals and trying to persuade them that their actions are stance independently wrong and violate the stance independent moral facts? Or do we say, we don't really give a shit what your standards are? You can't go murdering people. You can't go robbing people. You can't go on a genocidal rampage. We're going to stop you. No, we don't go around trying to persuade people. We go around stopping people. That's what laws are for. We impose our standards on other people all the time. And that's just how the world is.
It's a consequence of moral relativism. That's exactly how you would do that.
Also, what is it like? What nation states, like governments, that what they are monopolies on power. So they enforce the rules for better or worse. Yeah, that's the reality we live in. I'm not saying I endorse that. I'm saying that's how it is.
Now, before we go, I also want to look at one final thing, and that is this. I mentioned to fit this in earlier, but it's worth fitting in a very short time. There's some attractions to the view. There's one argument, there's another attraction to the view in the form of this argument. And it would be this. I've replicated the argument here. The idea that the diversity thesis, that is, look, man, anywhere you look, people believe in different things, different moral views. All right, we'll call that the diversity here. It's moral, right and wrong varies from society to society. If people believe they have different moral codes, let's say. And then from that, we'll have what we will call a dependency thesis, the idea that it seems that the relativist wants to make this inference. Moral principles derive their validity from cultural acceptance. And so that right there is an invalid argument, because put in here.
Okay, but like, who's making the argument? Like, a meta-ethical relativist is just never going to make this argument.
Instead of moral in number one, and moral in number two, moral principles, moral right and wrong, put in, I don't know, scientific, like scientific right and wrong varies from society to society. That's actually true, right? People disagree about scientific truths. Some people think the earth is flat. Some people think we didn't go to the moon, right? So some people think that it's a geocentric universe. So there is disagreement. Disagreement exists. That diversity thesis is true, not just for morality, but also for scientific truth. But it does not follow from that scientific principles.
Well, hold up. It doesn't follow from that. Isn't he saying that the third claim follows from the first two claims? I don't recall him saying that the second claim follows from the first claim. Is that something that he said?
Derive their validity or true thesis is true, wrong variable in cultural acceptance.
Yeah, I don't recall him saying that.
For does not follow from that scientific principles derive their validity or truth from the fact that some cultural accepts it. Like, therefore,
yeah, I don't know that two is supposed to be dependent on one. So a proponent of moral relativism that was appealing to these could think, yeah, well, one and two would be true if you have moral in there. But in when you swap them out for scientific, one is still true, but two is now false. So they could just think that. And I don't know that they're like, just because you could swap out one term with another term doesn't mean that you think that the same standards apply to both of those phenomena. You can think it applies in one case and not in the other.
Just because there's disagreement, there is no right answer, and everybody's right. We just throw up our hands. Everybody's right. You're right because your view derives its validity or truth from you accepting it, and so on and so on and so on. That does not work in any other sphere or discipline whatsoever on the face of the earth. So why think that it would happen in ethics? Now, it is difficult to get to the answer, and some things we may never get to. But that doesn't mean it's not worth trying, right? It's an objectivist. You still think these things are discoverable, even if you may not ever get to them. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't try, right? And you certainly shouldn't just throw your hands up and say, "Oh, nobody knows, nobody cares, or just whatever. I'll just do whatever I want," because these things certainly have real world consequences, as we saw at the end of the top 10 list. Now, there's more I want to talk about, more I want to say, and I could keep going on for another 20 or so minutes, but my computer ran out of
That's the
memory.
video. Okay, so we got through the whole video, and we didn't even hit 2 hours. I'm getting real tired here, though. I think you can kind of see me going, oh, drifting off. Wow, I've never done a video, I don't think, where I've been like half asleep at the end of it. I'm gonna have to get going and get some sleep. All right, everybody, that's it for me. I see a couple comments, but I'm not going to get to them today. I think I'm just going to close it out there. Do like the video, throw some comments in the comment section, subscribe to the channel, check out the links in the description. You could go to the original video here and watch that if you want to get through the whole thing without my commentary. I've got a link to my link tree, which has my links to all my other. It's a link to a bunch of links. So go check that out. All right, everybody, that's it for me. I will say goodnight to everybody. Take care.